I want to thank our sponsor today. You know, we're grateful to our sponsors. They allow us to have these webinars and keep them open at no cost to everyone who logs on to attitudemag.com. And our sponsor today is Fast Forward. Fast Forward was one of the original brain training interventions for reading problems, probably the original brain training intervention for reading problems, and the only one that's been proven by research at Stanford, MIT, and Harvard. With Fast Forward and a remote tutor, you will see changes in your child's reading in as little as 2 months. For more information, please visit the Fast Forward website, which is www.scilearn.com/ADD. I will post that to your screen. So thank you, Fast Forward. Just a bit more about Dr. Burns. She has worked with children and adults with language, auditory, and attentional issues for over 30 years, both in private practice and in a hospital setting. She's a professor at Northwestern University. She's the director of neuroscience education at Scientific Learning Corporation, the makers of Fast Forward, and a fellow of the American Speech and Language and Hearing Association. She's the author of hundreds of articles, 3 books, and many chapters, and she speaks frequently on the importance of applying the science of learning in early childhood education and understanding the adolescent brain and the K-12 classroom. So we're very, very fortunate to have her today. Please post your questions in the box on your screen. Post them at any time. If you have any problems hearing us, you should dial in via your phone line because this is internet-based and that's probably the source of the issue. If you'd like to take notes while Dr. Burns is speaking, you can download the slides right now from the control panel on your right. They're in the download section. Print those out and jot away if you wish. Or after the session ends, you'll find a replay of this webinar, including the slides, to download on the Attitude website, which is attitudemag.com/webinars. And in that section, you'll find lots of other terrific webinar replays and lots of other information. So thank you, everyone. And with that, let me turn it over to Martha S. Burns.
Thank you so much, Susan. Welcome, everyone. And as you know, we're really going to be talking about solutions for language and auditory processing problems that can often co-occur in children who have attention deficit disorders. I'm going to move on and just talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with how language and auditory processing overlap with attention in the brain. You're going to be getting kind of a little short course on neuroscience, and I think you'll find it interesting. We've learned more in the last probably 5 years about the human brain and how it learns and how it attends than we learned in the 100 years that led up to it. So there's a lot of new information, and it's interesting, and I think it will help you to understand issues that your own child might have or that you yourself might in some cases have. We're then going to talk about why learning disabilities and attention issues often occur together. We're going to talk about brain science. I'm going to update you on what we know about the human brain and how it changes all the time, and we call that brain plasticity. And because the brain changes all the time, it's changing in you today. If you learn anything new, you'll walk away from this webinar with a little bit different brain than you had when you started. So brain-based approaches are very effective because they can more directly exercise the kinds of processing systems that we want to exercise to make it easier to learn in school or to make it easier to pay attention to a book that you read. So we'll talk about all of that. We'll talk about what we know with brain training on how to improve attentional skills, how to improve auditory processing and language skills, and what can be done in terms of training the brain of children who've been diagnosed with a learning disability. So let's just start with how the brain matures. When we understand that, we can understand that the differences between a brain of a child who does really well in school, let's say, or a brain of a child who is attending very easily to a teacher talking or to a book that they're reading, those children's brains aren't any better than your brain or my brain. They're different, and they've matured differently. So the big difference that we all have in our brains is one of how the brain matures over time. And I want to talk about some important places in the brain that are really important for doing well in school. Now, you all know probably a good athlete or a good musician or maybe somebody who's a brilliant artist, and they're going to have a brain that's good at different kinds of skills. But to do well in school, there are a few core capacities we need. The first one we need is in the left hemisphere. You just saw it light up, and in a way that neuroscientists map the brain, it would have a number, and it would have a number that corresponds to what that part of the brain does. But this is a part of the brain that's very important for processing of bodily concepts. The next area you see lighting up, area 17, is very important for processing of vision. The next area you see light up is very important for processing of sound. And we need those areas to develop and mature, and we call those the sensory areas of the brain, so that we can start doing something like using language. So the brain develops from what we call these primary areas to areas that work together for perception and for knowledge and to integrate information. Now, one of the first times we could ever see this was some research done by Dr. Joy Hirsch at Columbia University. You can see this is her slide. We're looking at the left hemisphere of adults who are being asked, they're lying in something called a functional magnetic resonance scanner. Many of you know what MRI is, or magnetic resonance imaging. It's a way to look at tissue without an X-ray. And when you put a little F in front of it and you look at the brain, you can see the brain at work. And Dr. Joy Hirsch was one of those physicists who developed the technology to be able to see how the brain works when you're doing different kinds of things. In this particular slide, what you're looking at is how the brain works when you ask an adult to think of names of objects. So the adults might see an object like a bell, and when they think of the name of it, they press a button, or they might hear a bell ring, and when they can think of what the object is, they press a button, and so on. And what you see is these 4 areas of the brain light up. And those 4 areas are components of what we call a network. It would be like your cell phone network. So you might have a family and friends network, and you can be talking to somebody in California, and you're talking in real time, and you're all communicating with each other at the same time. And the brain operates that way too. So we have what we call these distributed regions. Those little yellow lights that you see are about probably 500 to 800 neurons, all firing at exactly the same time in the same split-second interval when someone presses a button to say, yes, I know the name of something. Now, what's important about this is that these networks form over time, and they form based on the experiences that you have. So we say that the human brain is experience-based, or it builds itself through experience. And if you have experiences with an English language, you would have a different brain than if you have experience or history with another language, let's say like Japanese or something. And the fact that the human brain is experience-dependent means that we can build our brain to be good at many, many different things depending upon the world that we are born into and depending on the world we need to function in. Now let's talk about how this experience dependency of the brain gets started. One of the first things that happens is after you see things, a baby sees things like a face, or a baby hears things like people talking, or a baby feels sensations, the brain is going to build up maps of those experiences. And one of the first maps to build up is going to be the map of sound. So as a child, as a little baby is exposed to sound, what's going to happen is the part of the brain that gets the input from the from the ear is going to start organizing itself kind of like keys on a piano keyboard for different sounds. So what you see in this slide was actually one of the first neuroscience studies of how this mapping occurs in a young brain. And it's an animal study because what they did is put little electrodes on the surface of the brain of animals. This animal, the P16, stands for 16-day-old. So it's postnatal 16, meaning this is a 6-day-old animal. And the rainbow that you see over on the right is actually just pitch. So the red part of the rainbow would be high-pitched sounds like ee, and the low part of the rainbow would be low-pitched sounds like woo. On a piano, it would be in the left and the right side. And you can see that at 16 days of age, this animal's actually only been listening to sound for 2 days, and it's listening to other animal sounds that were recorded at a zoo. What's happened is after 2 days of listening, this brain is starting to organize itself for different pitches. And by 6 days later, that's all it took in this young animal brain, we could take this frequency band that you see, this piano keyboard, and just lay it right over what we call the auditory cortex, the sound part of the brain, and we can see that the brain has started to fine-tune itself for the sounds that this animal's listening to. And by day 80, we have an adult rat, and you can see that you have very discreetly organized auditory system that's mapped itself for the sounds that this animal's going to have to pay attention to. Now, the early research was done with animals, but in the last few years, we've had quite a bit of research with human brains and how they become mapped. And this research was done by Mesgrani and published in the journal Science just last year. And what you can see is in this particular case, we're looking at this auditory part of the brain, the auditory cortex, and you can see all those dots that have different colors. And those dots that have different colors actually are the map that this person has for different kinds of speech sounds of English. So the turquoise dots, the kind of blue dots, are sounds like p and b and d and g. We call those plosive sounds because they have a little bit of explosion to them. And then the purple dots are neurons that only are interested in sounds that have noise in them. We call those fricatives like s and z and sh. And then we have vowel sounds, the red and the gold and the green are all different kinds of vowels. And then we have sounds like and that are that kind of lavender dot. And the brain has mapped itself for the speech sounds of English language. That takes years, by the way. It starts happening in an infant, but it's continuing to refine this map all the way through the first couple years of school. And actually, there's some research by Stanislas Dehaene, who's a neuroscientist who studies reading, that reading of English and learning to read words actually helps to make that map even more finely tuned. So if we look at then the parts of the brain in the back of the brain that become mapped for these sounds and for sights and for sensation, all of that will eventually be fed forward to the frontal lobe, what you're looking at here, the front third of your brain, which is about doing things. The frontal lobe is all about acting on the world around you. It includes things like talking, and it includes things like moving, but it also includes anything that you do that acts on the world, like planning ahead, or like scheduling yourself, or like being organized. And the further forward you move in the frontal lobe, the more you're getting into these kinds of what we call self-control issues or cognitive control issues of paying attention on demand and remembering what's important and forgetting what's irrelevant that the teacher said, and being able to pay attention to the teacher talking and sustain your attention and keep going, listening to a teacher and ignoring things that are going on around you. All of that is this pink and white area of the frontal lobe. Now, the part that I've highlighted is the part that's very important for speech and grammar and sequencing of fine motor skills. And it's going to be especially important for reading once students are able to read. That we call a bridge to those other white areas that you see that are number 10 and number 9 that are going to be in 46 that are going to be very important for using language to learn and for paying attention. And that's why you see this overlap of attention often with language, is many of those same parts of the brain are building and depending on each other. So when we come back and look at this view then of someone thinking of names, one of the adages we use, it's called the Hebbian adage, because a neurologist whose name was Hebb was the first one to talk about this, that neurons, when they fire together, eventually become wired together in these networks. And these networks allow us to process information efficiently. So you can start to see that we have regions of all over the brain, very important for language, that are going to be shared with other kinds of activities that are important for learning, like paying attention, like being organized, being able to be motivated and planning ahead. Now, to understand the networks, we need to know that they are linked together. And the way that they're linked together is through these fiber tracks that you're looking at here. And I'll explain what you're seeing in this particular slide, that we call the brain's communication system. When we talk about how the brain processes information, we talk about auditory processing, for example, we're talking about how information is traveling over these highways of the brain. Now, what you're looking at in this slide, at the bottom you see a blood vessel, and you see right on top of the blood vessel some little cells that are just going to be getting nutrients from the blood and delivering them to the neurons or the nerve cells. You see 3 nerve cells in this particular slide, and they are big round cells that have spikes going out or fingers going out. And the fingers going out are called dendrites, and they grow and they recede your whole life. So one way the brain is plastic, one way that it changes and learns new things, is by having new dendrites grow out of a neuron and reach out and grab on to another neuron that they've never touched before. Then, as we said, the dendrites are receiving information, but you also see that the neurons are linked by these long fibers that are wrapped in what this picture looks like bubbles. They're actually wrapped in fat, and what look like little bubbles on that long fiber track are actually just little fat cells that insulate that wire. Now, that's an axon that sends information from one neuron to another, and then a neuron's dendrite will pick up information from the axon and deliver it to the new neuron, and then it will send it on. So that's how these networks form in the brain, through this wiring system. Now, not only are the dendrites growing your whole life and receding, and that's what new knowledge is, but these fiber tracks, these axons, the myelin's getting thicker and thicker and thicker as we get better and better at certain skills. So if I use certain networks, let's say I really practice listening skills a lot, I have my child who's having trouble listening in school do exercises where they have to listen very carefully and they have to keep attending, and then they have to click a button to show what they've attended to correctly, then I can exercise that axon. And when I exercise the axon, that myelin is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker, the insulation, so that that fiber track will be able to process information faster and more efficiently. That's how we get better at something. We get better when our brain is more efficient through practice. So the brain has lots of ways to change, and that's one of the major ways the brain changes as children mature, is some fiber tracks get thicker and more myelinated and more efficient because the child uses them. So I like to give the example that when I grew up in a household where there were no athletes, and I am a klutz. I've never been a good athlete. I never practiced sports when I was young, and I never developed that part of my brain. My husband, on the other hand, was a pro athlete and was very good at athletics. And he practiced sports his whole life. And the way we're different, he probably has a cognitive potential to be a little better at athletics than I am to start with because of genes, but he exercised it from the time he was a very young child. I never did. And so I have a brain that's very good at language and that's very good at school. He had a brain that was very good at athletics. And that's simply a process of exercising the brain in certain ways over time. And you can see we couldn't even see these fiber tracks until we had a new technology that became available around 2007 that was called diffusion tensor imaging, and you can see this study was done in 2008 by a woman whose name is LaBelle. She did this research in Canada, and she was able to actually map out some of the important fiber tracks in the brain. Now, one big blue fiber tract, the one you see in the middle, is very important for language and reading and handling symbol skills and music. The yellow one you see at the front of the brain there, the uncinate fasciculus, is very important for some of the skills that go into being able to monitor the outcome of your actions and having a lot of self-control. But all of these fiber tracts are maturing at different rates, and they're maturing in different ways. And this is just LaBelle's research. It's a little hard to see on your own computer screen. You'll have the handout of it, but you can see that each of those colored fiber tracts that you're looking at has a different curve of maturing. So what we're looking at in each of those squares that you see that's surrounding the picture, you're looking at a specific fiber tract that is labeled for you, but also is color-coded for you. And we're looking at how it matures, how it gets thicker from the time a child's 5 till the time a person is 30 years of age. Now notice some of the fiber tracts are still maturing when we're 30 years of age. That means our brain is still getting better at some things when we're 30 and 35. Other fiber tracts develop very, very early, and then they kind of level off. And one of the fiber tracts that develops very early is the third one up on the right. If you're looking at the actual fiber tracts, that's the bottom long fasciculus, the purple one that you see in the top picture, and that's very important for listening and for perceiving speech sounds. So that's a fiber tract that develops early because we want human beings use language, and we want them to be able to learn language and use language very early. But other fiber tracts, like the second one up from the right that's so important for reading and math, that's developing into our teens, and it matches the time frame when kids are in school. But you can see that different fiber tracts then are going to support different kinds of skills. And this was research done by a good friend of mine, Nina Dronkers, that was actually published in 2012 on the white matter tracts that are very important for being able to hear and understand speech. And so we call that the auditory speech processing system. And what I want you to just get a look at is they are taking up almost the entire left hemisphere. Almost the entire left side of the human brain is devoted to listening to people talk. Human beings are very interested in speech and language, and a lot of our brain is devoted to that. So you can see that if a child had an auditory processing problem, it would cut across lots of different fiber tracts, and it would affect lots of what we do with the left side of our brain, like do math and read and do other kinds of computations. Now, this is a wonderful diagram of the difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere in language processing. Just being able to use language, to be able to perceive it, that's what the big red circle is the parts of the brain important for perceiving speech sounds accurately and easily. And the blue is the part of the brain in the frontal lobe that's so important for using speech to communicate, to talk. But all the kind of pink and lavender and gold is the part of the brain that comprehends language. And again, notice how much of the left hemisphere, the left side of your brain, is devoted to the skill of language. And so when we're talking about learning disabilities, we're talking about how these fiber tracts and these systems overlap. So it would be very unusual for a child or an adult to have a problem with one small part of processing and not have it interact with other kinds of processing. So let's look at attention now, and what you can see is how attention is represented in the brain and how it's going to overlap with this huge part of the brain that's devoted to perception of speech and then use of language. And you're looking at a slide right now that is the part of the brain that's very important for something we call selective attention. Selective attention is your ability to listen to me talk and ignore everything else that's going on. So you are selecting what you're listening to. Now, you have to learn to select what you're listening to. A young child is listening and paying attention to everything in the world. The world is a fascinating place to a young child. So they're fascinated with the colored leaves that we now see in the fall, and they're fascinated with cars, and when cars go by or airplanes go by, that fascinates them, and they're fascinated with what the music, and they're fascinated with sound, and they're fascinated with sensations of all kinds. And they have to learn to filter that, and they have to learn, oh my gosh, when mom's talking, I should be paying attention to mom and not listening to the television. Or when I'm in school, I have to pay attention to what the teacher says and ignore what that little boy sitting next to me is doing. And that attentional maturation depends upon the maturation of this very front part of the brain, which takes a long time, by the way. This front part of the brain is the last part of the brain to mature, and it's maturing into our teens and into our 20s. So attention gets better and better and better the older we get. And so when we have a child who's having trouble with attention, it doesn't mean that they have anything wrong with their brain per se, it just means their brain, that part of their brain, is maturing a little more slowly. Now, most neuroscientists right now, most brain scientists, talk about the fact that attention has two levels, if you will. And so we have one level which is our impulsive level. The impulses that we have drive our rapid response to a situation. So if I'm walking down the street and something worries me, or I'm a little scared of something, then my impulses will jump in and I will pay attention to getting away from whatever that is that's worrying me. On the other hand, we have this part of our attention that's based on reason, where we say, well, I want to attend to this and I want to ignore these other things. And that's the reason part of setting goals and having objectives. So neuroscientists call that the dual system model of attention and self-control. If you have problems at the low level, you might be very impulsive. You might have trouble sitting in a chair and not getting up and walking around, or you might have trouble ignoring your emails when they come in, or texts that come in on your smartphone. But when you have trouble at higher levels, then what's going to happen is you're going to have problems being goal-oriented with your attention. A person who has the better high level will be able to say, okay, even though this lecture is kind of complicated, I'm going to pay attention to it because it's important to me and it's important to working with my child. And so we're able to use the higher parts of our brain to kind of override our impulses, our desire to get up and go get something to eat or get something to drink. So we have these two systems. The low-level system, again, is based on reward. It's based on immediate needs. It's based on what we call immediate gratification. I want to do what feels good right now. I'll worry about tomorrow. And then the upper-level system is working on maintaining a goal, working toward a goal. And part of that higher level system includes not just paying attention, but also remembering things in the short term. And we call that working memory. So all of you who are listening to this lecture have to listen to me talk, but you also have to remember what I said 5 minutes ago about the brain and 10 minutes ago about the brain so that you can pull it all together. When you read a book, you have to remember when you're on chapter 3 who all the characters were in chapter 1. That's called working memory. It takes work, takes self-control, and it's part of this higher level attentional system. Adele Diamond, who's one of the major researchers in differences between different kinds of attentional problems, has said that a prominent characteristic of ADD, that is attention deficit disorder without hyperactivity, is problems with auditory processing, difficulty perceiving speech, especially in a noisy environment, and problems with working memory. When you have all of that, what happens is a person tunes out a lot. So a student who tunes out of the teacher talking in a classroom is a student who's having trouble with listening to the teacher, perceiving everything the teacher's saying quickly and easily, and holding on to it. So they tend to tune out and daydream. Whereas a child who has ADHD might be more fidgety and hyperactive. So what are some clues that would let you know what kind of issues your child might have, or that you yourself might have, that would be a clue to, do I have this auditory processing or language processing issue? Do I have a memory issue? Or do I have a combination of things? So one thing we know is that when students have trouble in the classroom, if they're slow on multiple choice tests, if they read the question, then they read A, then they go back and read the question again, and then they read A and B and C, and then they kind of go back to double check what the question said again because they've forgotten, and then they read A, B, C, D. Those children may know the content. They may be able to do very well with it. They might have learned a lot, but they take the test slowly, and that's because of a working memory problem. You can also see that when children reread a lot. If they read a paragraph and realize that they have forgotten what the paragraph had in it, could have been they weren't paying attention, but it also could have been that they were having trouble with remembering it, and so they go back to read it again. You also see children who have trouble with memorization, have trouble memorizing their math facts, have trouble memorizing spelling words. Often that's a working memory issue. You might also see that they have problems doing class assignments quickly and easily. That can be attention, but it can also be this kind of memory problem. And then children who have word finding problems, who can't name quickly and easily, or problems with spelling, often that presents itself with children who have memory problems as well as attentional problems. Children who have trouble following commands, children who have trouble remembering the question if they're called on in class. Teacher asks a question, student is called on, and they say, I'm sorry, what did you say? They tune out sometimes in classroom situations, or they might have difficulty specifically with sounding out words or reading or spelling. Or they might have behavior problems because school is just really hard for them, and so they tend to fool around in a class because listening is too difficult. So poor listeners or children who tune out, that can be an auditory processing problem. Children ask, huh, or what, whenever they're given instructions. That also can be a memory or an auditory processing problem. They're looking around a lot to see what other kids are doing after the teacher gives instructions. That could be the sign of a memory or an auditory processing problem. Whereas if they're fidgety or impulsive, or they yell out answers, or they have a lack of self-control, that's more typical of ADHD. So what areas can we boost with brain-based activities, and how? Well, one thing, if we have a child who tunes out, we have a child who can't sit still, we can actually train attentional skills through brain activities, brain-based activities where they have to sit still and they have to respond consistently over and over and over again. If they take a break, they make a mistake, and so you can build attentional skills with brain exercises. You can build memory exercises if children had trouble with math facts or have trouble with letter sounds or nursery rhymes. Remembering that, we can actually build memory skills. We can make memory easier for a child and improve this capacity to remember online. If they have auditory processing problems, we can train students out of that with tasks that specifically have them listen for a specific sound, like ba, 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 da, and be able to signal when it changes. And we can build sequencing skills. We know that auditory processing problems can also be aided through classroom amplification. So just by making the teacher's voice louder and the noise in the classroom that is not relevant softer, the student can actually exercise and build their brain to be better at auditory processing. And we have quite a bit of research on that. My colleague at Northwestern, Nina Kraus, has done quite a bit of research on auditory processing problems. So what are some of the brain-based interventions that are out there that we have shown really can build some of these underlying skills? Remember, the human brain is plastic and experience dependent, so it can prune itself at any age to be better at one set of skills, and it's not hard to do, and it can be built into technological interventions that drive memory skills, attentional skills, processing speed, especially auditory processing of speech and language, sequencing skills. And by building these underlying capacities, we can get very fast and enduring results and help students to sit in a classroom and learn on demand much better. And just a new study that was published this year in February looked at these neuroscience-based, these brain-based interventions. And it concluded that brain-based interventions are useful for educators, that the content does matter, that auditory training is very important for building listening skills and building learning skills, and that the gains are long-lasting. What this particular meta-analysis found was that any brain-based programs that have phonological and auditory tasks, phonological meaning speech sound tasks, and if they're auditory, they have repeatedly gained remedial effects for learning disabled students. And we know that a lot of the effective neuroscience-based interventions also build in an attentional component. So another study just published a couple of weeks ago, actually, in the journal Nature Neuroscience, said if you want to get your brain to attend better, use exercises that train not just attention, but broad-based kinds of memory and language skills as well. So the future direction for brain-based attentional intervention is to understand the development of the brain and how children with attentional problems are different, rehabilitate, get in and augment these less than efficient systems just by strengthening the relevant network connections that are important from the ground up. And you can improve visual attention networks and auditory attention networks and improve reading in general. So in conclusion then, and we'll take questions, beyond attention training, the development of attention function occurs through the coupling of these perceptual maps and all of these memory capacities. If we can intervene by having exercises that work on all of these together, we can have dramatic effects on the brain. This is one program, the people that are sponsoring this, the Fast Forward program, and you can see this was research that was done at Stanford University and then replicated at Harvard. You have typical on the left, the brain of typical 7-year-old readers. You're looking at the part of the brain that's lighting up when they're doing a task where they have to rhyme. If you look at that fMRI with the struggling reader, you can see those brain areas haven't matured. But after just 6 weeks, 90 minutes a day of a brain training exercise, those parts of the brain that are very important for learning to read and for listening in a classroom and paying attention have developed. And separate research showed that if you look at attentional skills in these children, especially auditory attentional skills in learning impaired children, That's the group, those bars on the left-hand side, typically developing. That's what that TD stands for, is typically developing children. And then a control group is the no treatment. You can see that the white bars mean that those kids are having a lot of trouble with auditory attention. The gray bars are after 6 weeks of just this generalized training in memory, attention, processing skills. The brain training improves all of those capacities. So in summary, differences in brain maturation we now know underlie problems with attention, with learning, and with auditory processing. But the brain changes all the time, and we can design exercises, neuroscientists can, to specifically target the brain areas and the pathways that are important for these skills that make learning so much easier for some students than others. The areas overlap, so research points to the importance of cross-training several areas at a time to build attention, processing, and language skills. And the results can be fast and enduring. Questions?
Thank you. So if everyone post your questions. You know, I think what would be really helpful is if you could explain a little bit about how this, how brain training works, what actually takes place on a daily basis.
Okay.
If a child is doing brain training.
All right.
Where are they doing it? What are they doing? Is it at school? Is it at home? What actually happens?
Great question. So the programs that are out there now, and there aren't too many, you're going to see more and more come along, but the programs that are out there now, like the Fast Forward program, for example, are available to parents to use in their home. That's one way you can do it, so that they can use their own iPad or other device, and the student can do anything from a half an hour a day to exercises on their iPad or their computer at home to up to an hour and a half if they want a day, depending on how quickly they want to move through it. They would do it 5 days a week. And to the child or the participant, it looks like a game. Just looks like a video game. But actually, some of the exercises will be working on speech processing. So some of the exercises will be things like listening to sounds repeat themselves and then change. Some of the exercises will just be working on memory, especially what we call phonological memory. So it would be like a concentration game where a student would hear big and then dig and then fig and then big again, and they'd have to remember where on their concentration grid was the big that they heard before and click that on. To them it's a game, but to the brain you're just building the capacity for memory, especially memory for sounds. Some of the exercises will actually have words flying across the page, and it would be just like a video game with an object that you'd have to catch at a certain point, but in this case the student might hear a sight word like the word sight or the word was, and then words will flash across the page and the student has to click them on when the right word flashes on. That's a known attentional exercise, but you're also getting at sight word reading at the same time. So the well-developed programs, the student feels like they're playing a game, but they're actually reading, they're actually remembering, they're actually being forced to pay attention for longer and longer periods of time.
Does that help? Yeah, that's very helpful. I guess one of the questions that parents are asking is, your presentation was fascinating but very high level, and they're wondering, are there practical things that they can do in the household to help their children manage language disabilities specifically, and or attentional delays or disabilities? What would you advise them to do?
Okay, so some of the most practical things we can do with our children, one very practical thing, depending on the child's age, is to have children read aloud if they can read, or if they can't read themselves, and the parent reads to the child. Oral reading, where the child is sitting listening to a story being read to them, and they can even do books on tape, is fine for building up auditory skills. But having to listen to a story and then answer questions about it. It's not enough just to play a tape for a child or do a read to a child, but having to periodically answer questions about what you're reading is kind of what I like to call a triple whammy. It's something where you have to pay attention. If any of you have ever done audiobooks in a car and you know you're driving and all of a sudden you realize you haven't paid attention for the last 10 minutes and you're trying to rewind figuring out where you stopped paying attention. Audiobooks are a great way in an older student, for example, to improve attentional skills, language skills, and their whole memory capacity, their working memory capacity. In a younger child, you can start this when they're very little, reading a storybook to a child at night in a quiet room, often half an hour before bed is a wonderful time, and a bedroom is very quiet, there's not a lot of noise, where mom reads a page and then asks the student, where is the mouse? Where is the house? Where is the cat in the hat? And reading to the child but asking questions maintains the child's attention, but listening to a story also builds memory and language skills at the same time. The important thing is you need a response. So reading, once a child can read, they can start reading aloud too. Parent can read a page, child can read a page. It's probably one of the simplest and best things a parent can do with a child who has language problems and or attention and memory problems.
That's a great suggestion. I mean, in my old household with two children with variously different language disabilities, books on tape were just amazing for them.
Yeah,
Harry
and very
Potter,
practical
Harry Potter
and
on
very
tape,
easy.
wow, yeah. Yeah, my kids could recite them, and then both of them with language disabilities. So yeah, I'm a believer. And I think your point about interacting, asking questions is a really good one. Is there any other, that's just a wonderful, simple tip for families. Is there anything else that you'd recommend?
I would say
what about working memory? Is working memory also teachable?
Yeah, so just playing concentration with your child builds working memory skills. Or doing something like, I don't know how many of you ever played the game where I'm going on a trip and I'm going to take something that starts with an A, and then the next person has to take something and remember what you took that starts with the A, the apple, and then they say they're going to take a book, and then the next child says they're going to take an apple, a book, and a car. That's an auditory working memory exercise and also a language exercise. So those kinds of games, any kind of game that you play with a child where they have to maintain their attention, they have to remember a series of items, that's great for working on those kinds of skills. And all of that builds attention, by the way.
Yeah, of course it does, sure. Are these programs equally effective for adults? There are a number of people on the webinar who are adults who have been diagnosed fairly recently with language processing disabilities that they just didn't know. Well, they knew they had something, but they didn't know the name of it until they were adults. And also a parent of an 18-year-old who's still struggling with this. Are these programs, whether it be Fast Forward or another one or concentration games, are they equally helpful as the brain is already matured, if you will?
Yes. Now, there is a company that specializes in the adult brain, and they have online exercises for adults, specifically with memory exercises, with attention exercises, and they are all neuroscientists that develop this, and all of their programs have been researched. And that company is called Posit Science, but the exercises are called Brain HQ. And just as a point of clarification, I have nothing to do with that company, except I do know one of the founders of it. But those were designed initially for aging adults, because when adults age, they will start having attentional and processing problems that go along with aging and memory issues. But they have been designed for adults who have been kind of flew under the radar. They had some of these issues, but they were never enough that the person realized that's why academics was so hard for them.
Wow.
And a big clinical group I work with are young adults who got through high school, but they get into college and they're really, really struggling. And often those are adults, when you do some testing, you find some very subtle
Right.
but real problems with memory, problems with attention, problems with language that they were able to compensate for in high school, but they can't when everything's a lecture class. They fall apart.
Right. Yeah, lecture classes are really tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Carol, who's listening in, suggests to the group a website called fabookclub.com. Free online book club gives parents names of books and questions to ask their kids. Thanks.
Wow,
Carol.
that's great. Yeah.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, that sounds terrific. Can we just turn to diagnosis for a moment? People are wondering how language processing disabilities are diagnosed. Is there a definitive way to diagnose auditory processing weakness? Are there specific tests? And what's happening with this in school these days? A number of people have posted that they find that the schools are no longer willing to talk about auditory processing disabilities, disorders, or even take it on. What are you finding in that regard?
Okay, so that's a really good question. Auditory processing, there are two ways it's diagnosed. One, probably the most objective way to have an auditory processing problem diagnosed is to go to an audiologist. That's a hearing specialist who specializes, they use calibrated equipment. They have very specialized kinds of auditory tasks. They have a person do in a soundproof booth where they've very carefully controlled the sound, and they can diagnose the auditory processing problems. The reason that schools don't look at that specifically is that an auditory processing problem, as we've already said, some people can compensate for them well. So they don't necessarily cause a child to have a problem academically. And so schools don't consider that a qualifying diagnosis for special services. If the student is failing in school, then you can have them tested for language impairment or other kinds of learning disabilities, specific learning disabilities. But if it's an auditory processing problem or if it's an attentional problem, many school districts consider that a non-qualifying diagnosis.
Wow.
And so that testing is often done by the parents on their own. Now, just so most parents know, you can go, if you live near a university, many universities would have hearing clinics that would do this kind of testing for a child that would be lower cost. But you can also go to a local audiologist if they specialize in that. And many psychologists also have tests that they give to students that are a way of looking at auditory processing problems a little more indirectly.
That's fascinating. I really had no idea that this was audiology based, and that's really interesting. And that so parents really are on their own to look for these indicators of problems. How does this auditory processing, language processing affect reading?
Well, in the English language, in any alphabetic language, which English is, but let's say Japanese is not an alphabetic language, but any alphabetic language where you have letters and the letters all have a sound, when a child has an auditory processing problem, what they often have trouble doing is learning the sounds that go with the letters. So they can memorize a word. I have a daughter who had an auditory processing problem and then a reading problem, and she memorized words because I read to her when she was a young girl. So she memorized all of the beginning reading vocabulary. But when she got into the 3rd and 4th grade and she had to start decoding, sounding words out, she couldn't do that because she couldn't remember the sounds that went with the letters. And that's what you often see happen with students who have auditory processing problems, is they have trouble sounding words out. They can memorize words, especially if they have a good visual memory, but auditorily they may just have a terrible time. So when they read aloud, they read slowly, and they misread a word like horse. They may read it as house, a word that looks similar. So it will really impact that reading and spelling, which in turn then impacts the speed that they read, which in turn impacts how they comprehend and how they learn from reading later on.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess there's some question in some of the listeners' minds between language and problems in children with ADHD versus children on the autism spectrum. There are 3 or 4 people who are asking if you see a difference between an autistic spectrum language issue versus an attentional one.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. And the new research that is out there on autism spectrum disorders is really what you have with autism spectrum disorders is problems in maturation of several areas simultaneously. So with a child who has an auditory processing problem and an attentional problem, let's say, they may be very good at compensating visually, and they may be very good at kind of masking their problem. That's why sometimes you don't even identify them until they're in middle school or high school or even in some cases college. Child on the autism spectrum is having a lot of problems processing all information. They might be better at visual than auditory, but the world to them is noisy and very confusing. And so it cuts across many domains, autism, as opposed to the more kinds of specific problems we see with just auditory processing.
Just auditory processing. That's really fascinating. Yeah. How about a nonverbal, a quote-unquote nonverbal learning disability?
Okay, so a nonverbal learning disability is often a problem with social skills and with reading people's intentions. Sometimes we call that theory of mind. So they have trouble with nonverbal skills. They might have trouble with visual spatial skills as well, but they're very good with language. And those children might be do real well in school, but they just have trouble making friends. They have trouble getting to understand social cues oftentimes, and they may have trouble with maps and drawing and some other kinds of, and art and things like that.
Visual, right? Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah. And usually they have a huge gap in between their verbal scores and their sort of spatial scores in testing, right?
Exactly.
Any tips for teachers? We seem to have a lot of teachers online, and I think that's great. Welcome, teachers, who are asking for any help, any suggestions you might have for classroom work with children with auditory processing problems.
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm glad teachers are there, because this is so hard for teachers, because these are the students that disrupt the class. These are the students that aren't, the teacher will say they just have terrible listening skills. A few things that audiologists would recommend if a child has an auditory processing problem is move them to the front of the class. Sometimes teachers are reluctant to do that because those are the students that cause trouble and they don't want them disrupting the class, but actually if you move the student forward in the class so they can see the teacher's face when she's talking and so that they can hear the teacher better, the auditory signal is clear, that will help those students with auditory processing problems. Also, if you can get classroom amplification, if the school can afford that, that's wonderful because you can amplify the teacher's voice and the student will get that much more easily and they'll listen better. Then also, if those students, the teacher can just periodically say, just remind the student, pay attention, did you get what I just said? And just if the teacher just can ask those students every once in a while to keep them attending, what did I just say, Billy? Or Mary, how do you feel about that? Or ask a question just to keep those students on their toes, because what those students learn how to do is tune out. And when they tune out, they just go into la-la land and they can be there very comfortably for a half an hour or so. So teachers can kind of just keep pulling them into the classroom, but teachers have 30-some kids in a classroom, so it becomes difficult, and that's where if you can have an audiologist come and help with an amplification device for that classroom, it would probably really help those kids a lot.
Okay. Can you distinguish between language processing and auditory processing problems?
Sure.
Are those terms used interchangeably? I think there's some confusion.
Sometimes they are, but they are actually different. They can co-occur, but often children with auditory processing problems will have trouble developing language skills. And so listening comprehension will be an issue. But they can occur separately. So you can have children with auditory processing issues that really have pretty good language skills. If they come from a home where people talk a lot, they learn to overcome that auditory processing and they have pretty good language skills, but they're going to have trouble with listening comprehension. If they don't have something visual to tune into, that'll be a problem. Whereas a child with a language problem language processing often has trouble with naming, they have trouble with listening comprehension, they are going to have trouble learning to read, they are going to have trouble with all aspects of language, not just, even vocabulary will be a problem for them, not just listening comprehension.
Okay, so what did you say, that phrase, that's more of an auditory processing, not necessarily a language processing indicator? The child that always says, what did you say? What did you say?
Well, they're going to, that's right, they're going to be like you, they're going to go, huh, what,
right,
huh?
Right.
But it's not that when you repeat it, they get it because they were tuning out or they couldn't handle it quickly enough. Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time. So much interesting things. One last question. I guess there's a big hunger for practical tips.
Yes, of course.
Of course, practical suggestions. And you've made some great ones, the learning and asking questions. Anything in your last minutes, anything else you'd like to suggest?
Well, what I would say to parents and teachers and all of us is that having periods of a time where a student or a child has to listen to you, whether you're reading a story to them and they have to listen to answer questions, or whether you're having a conversation at the dinner table and there are no smartphones and there's no television to watch, and you're demanding that the child pay attention to an ongoing conversation for a period of time. Those are really important in our society, and we're getting away from that because we have so much multimedia out there. So as a practical, just as parents, just having devoted time, listening times, where you listen and even to somebody's story, but you're listening and you're having to answer questions about it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. This is super terrific. Everyone, if you want to hear this again and follow, because I know it was quite high level, it'll be on our website, attitudemag.com/webinars, and we thank Martha Burns and we thank Fast Forward, the program for helping kids learn to process language, to address language processing disabilities. We thank both of you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.